So can everyone hear me? Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah, all right, good. Wanted to make sure. I certainly don't want to talk for an hour and nobody hear what I say. One thing that Thanissaro Bhikkhu always says is that his teacher told him that he should not try to teach the Dhamma to people who had not been very recently meditating. So I understand the usual thing that is done during these is to meditate for half an hour at the beginning. And so that's exactly what we're going to do now. So I will do a bit of guiding, and then after a little bit, I will guide less and less, and then ring the bell when it's time for us to actually talk about dependent origination. So in order to begin, get yourself settled. It's important to be comfortable. More important to be comfortable than to look good. If you're uncomfortable, it'll generate aversion, which is the second of the 5 hindrances, and that's not going to work well with your meditation. So, settle yourself into your comfortable posture. And then put your attention on the physical sensations associated with breathing. If you can notice those sensations at your nostrils, that will work to get you more concentrated. And noticing them at the belly or the rise and fall of the chest. But I'd say work with whatever is most familiar and comfortable for you. And you're just trying to notice the tactile sensations of your breathing. Your breathing should be unmanipulated, just the natural breathing. Don't force it. Don't do anything to make it easier to notice. Just breathe naturally with your attention on the tactile sensations of breathing. If your attention should wander away from the breathing, or actually, when your attention wanders away from the breathing, it's not a big deal. We are the progeny of creatures who had to pay attention to their environment. If they didn't, they got eaten and didn't reproduce. So we have minds that tend to want to check things out. When your attention wanders off, it's good to label the distraction. Planning, wanting, upset, nonsense. The first word is always correct. And then relax. Relax is very important. And bring your attention back to the tactile sensations of breathing. The attitude you want is one of relaxed diligence. It's a very relaxed thing you're doing, just sitting there, observing yourself breathing. But you want to be diligent about noticing when you become distracted. Label, relax again, and back to the attention on the breathing. It's counterproductive to force your attention on the breath. And we want the middle way, as usual, between relaxed and diligence. Forcing is not the middle way. also helpful if you put a little wispy Buddha smile on your face. Smiling generates endorphins. Endorphins make you feel good. Feeling good will help your meditation go better. So we're going to take a 90-second break. If you want to stand up and stretch, move around. I would certainly appreciate it if you can turn on your video camera. When I give a talk, I'm used to seeing the people I'm talking to, so I think it'll make it just easier for me to give the talk. So see you in 90 seconds. So, dependent origination. Sariputta quotes the Buddha in Majjhima 28 as saying, "One who sees the Dharma sees dependent origination. One who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma." It's really the heart of what the Buddha was teaching. You might remember after his awakening, the Buddha was reluctant to teach. He thought, this generation is addicted to their lifestyle. People who are addicted to their lifestyle are going to have trouble seeing this important point. That conditionality, dependent origination. Idapataya cha paticca samuppada. Luckily for us, he did decide that there were a few people with little dust in their eyes and did decide to teach. When dependent origination is usually taught, what's taught are the 12 links of dependent origination. My best guess is that the 12 links were, shall we say, a late development in dependent origination. Carolyn Reese Davids referred to them as a curious old rune. Yeah, it's not really clear what's going on there. So tonight, rather than starting with the 12 links of dependent origination, I thought it might be nice to start at the beginning. Of course, you might be wondering, where's the beginning? Well, there's a collection of discourses in the Khuddaka Nikaya called the Suta Nipata. In book 4 of the Suta Nipata, it's called the Atthakavagga, the Book of Eights. And most scholars agree that the Book of Eights is very early material. Early in the sense that it probably goes back to the time of the Buddha, and also early in the sense that it appears to show the Buddha early in his ministry. There are no monasteries, there are no monks and nuns. We have a picture of a solitary teacher teaching various people. And we know from other sources that this was the Buddha's life for the first 3 years of his ministry. Remember, after he had acquired 60 Arhat disciples, he sent all of them to go no two in the same direction, including himself. Now, in the Book of Eights, the 11th sutta, so Suta Nipata 4:11, is a sutta entitled Quarrels and Disputes. And the question is asked, what is the origin of quarrels and disputes? And the answer is, people find things endearing. Oh yeah. You don't argue about stuff that you don't care about. There's no quarreling, disputing over, something that's just irrelevant. It's only the stuff that you really got your hooks into that you find endearing. And then, quarrels and disputes can arise, which of course only leads to another question. Why do people find things endearing? Because they're desirable. If there's something you want, something you desire, and you get it, and you like it, and you want to keep it, that's the kind of stuff that you might get caught up in a quarrel and dispute about. We don't find anything endearing unless it's also found to be desirable. I want to get it. I've got it. Don't you try and take it away from me. Of course, this only raises the question, why do people find things desirable? It is said in this world, it is pleasant. It is not pleasant. Think about it. The things you find desirable produce what we today call pleasant vedana, a pleasant sensation, pleasant feeling. And the stuff that we find undesirable is the stuff that produces an unpleasant vedana. So where do these pleasant and unpleasant come from? Sense contact. Every time we experience any sensory input, whether from the 5 external senses or from the mind, within 1/10 of a second, neuroscience tells us, we will also judge it, categorize it as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. This makes sense. We're using our sensory input to navigate the environment. And this is our first sort. Here's the stuff that's desirable, I might want to get it. Here's the stuff that's undesirable, I might want to get rid of it. And the pleasant, that's the desirable. And the unpleasant, that's the undesirable. We get who knows how many sense contacts a day. Millions, probably. Certainly on the order of 1 a second. That would be 100,000. And we're deciding, is this something I can go after? This is something I got to avoid? This is something I can ignore. And that's based on whether it generates the pleasant or the unpleasant. Now, this raises the question, where do the sense contacts come from? Namarupa. Namarupa is a very important and interesting word. Literally, it means name and form. In the context of dependent origination, you often see it translated as mind and body, or mentality and materiality. It's a phrase I've been studying for a number of years, trying to come up with an understanding of something that fits in all of the situations where it's used. It seems to be something on the order of concept and manifestation. There's the concept of a finger snap. And there's also the manifestation of a finger snap. Concept, finger snap, right? You got that? Manifestation of a finger snap. So I think this is a more general term, but particularly in discussions of dependent origination, we find it interpreted as mind and body. So what do we have here? Namarupa, mind and body if you want, a concept and manifestation if you want. However, dependent on that, sense contacts arise. And those sense contacts are going to generate the pleasant and the unpleasant. We find the pleasant desirable. We find the unpleasant undesirable. And we get entangled with the pleasant. We become endeared to it. And if we're not careful, that winds up leading to quarrels and disputes. So each of these is dependently originated. Quarrels and disputes dependently originate from the endearing, and the endearing dependently originates from the desirable, and the desirable dependently originates from pleasant and unpleasant. The pleasant and unpleasant dependently originate from sense contacts, and sense contacts dependently originate from Namarupa. Now, if you know the 12 links of dependent origination, you might be going, well, that's not the 12 links. I mean, there's only two that really match up, sense contact and Namarupa. But, that pleasant and unpleasant, well, that's pretty close to Vedana. The word Vedana doesn't appear in Suta Nipata 411, but the same concept is there. So, yeah, that's there. And dependent on Vedana in the 12 links, we find craving. And actually in the suttas, craving and desire are sometimes used synonymously. Take a look, for example, at Majjhima 109, where we find desire rather than craving. And endearing, well, the stuff that's endearing, that's the stuff we cling to. There's a lot of similarity there. And quarrels and disputes, they're dukkha. So if we translate this sutta into the closest words in the 12 links of dependent origination, what we have is dukkha arises dependent on clinging, which arises dependent on craving, which arises dependent on Vedana, which arises dependent on sense contacts, which arise dependent on Namarupa, mind and body, concept and manifestation. This is a subset of the 12 links, and it basically tells how we get into trouble being dukkha, right? You've got a mind and body, it's got senses, it's going to get sense contacts, that's going to generate Vedana. This is a given. Nothing you can do about it. When those Vedana are generated, if you're not careful, you fall into craving, Craving is I want it. And clinging. Clinging is I've got it. And that's a setup for dukkha. Second noble truth. Dukkha arises dependent on craving. In fact, my teacher said that the Four Noble Truths are actually dependent origination in telegram style. I guess today we have to say in Twitter style. It's just highlighting some of the key points. Now, we could take a look at the 12 links and see that we have this subset in there. There's an important sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, Book 12, on dependent origination. This is number 65. And it appears to describe what the Buddha's contemplation was the night of his awakening. The Buddha was brilliant. He didn't try and figure out the cause of dukkha, why dukkha arises. What's the metaphysics of dukkha? He was looking for a necessary condition for the arising of dukkha. This is something that was apparently not particularly well known at the time of the Buddha, this idea of necessary conditions. And it's a brilliant thing. For example, you want to turn off the light? You don't have to go blow up the power plant. I mean, that's a necessary condition. You don't have to cut the wires. You just turn off the light switch, right? If you can find a necessary condition you can manipulate, you can turn off something that's happening, and by keeping the necessary condition off, that thing won't re-arise. The light switch doesn't cause the light. The light is caused by excited electrons in the light bulb. But the light switch is a necessary condition. Yep, turn it off. No more light. The Buddha's not looking for metaphysics of dukkha. He's looking for a necessary condition. So he sits down under the Bodhi tree and he goes, old age, sickness, death, pain, sorrow, grief, lamentation, despair. What do they depend upon? Well, they depend upon being born. If you don't get born, you don't experience dukkha. That's definitely a necessary condition for dukkha, but not easily manipulatable. I mean, just by looking at all of you, I can tell you got born. You're not going to be able to prevent dukkha by preventing getting born. That's not enough. But the Buddha kept exploring. Why does birth happen? What's a necessary condition for birth? Well, birth appears to arise due to becoming. Mother Nature has this urge to reproduce. This makes total sense from an evolutionary standpoint. If there's a species that has no urge to reproduce, it goes extinct. Right? So this becoming is what makes a species happen. It leads to birth. And old age, sickness, and death follows from that. So becoming. Well, for a species to survive, it has to have this urge to keep wanting to survive, clinging to existing. Clinging is a necessary condition for becoming, which leads to birth and old age, sickness, and death. Clinging. What do you cling to? You cling to the good stuff, the stuff that you really want. I mean, if you have a fruitcake, somebody gives you a fruitcake for Christmas and you don't like fruitcake, and your friend comes over and says, oh, fruitcake, I love fruitcake. You're like, hey, you want the fruitcake? You don't find fruitcake desirable. There's no clinging. But Your iPhone, yeah, you probably cling to that. It's desirable, right? You crave it. The stuff that we crave is the stuff that we cling to. And the clinging can lead to becoming birth, old age, sickness, and death, and all the rest of the dukkha. The craving arises from the Vedana. What do you crave? Chocolate ice cream? Do you crave it because it has a brown color? No. Do you crave it because you pay money for it? No, it's the other way around. You pay money for it because you crave it. You crave it because it tastes good. It produces pleasant Vedana. And yeah, the craving can be so much you eat the whole pint in one sitting. Then if you didn't eat the whole thing, you're clinging to it. I hope your roommate doesn't eat it. Right? Becoming birth, death. So the craving, what does that arise dependent on? You're in the grocery store. Are you craving the ice cream at that point? Or you might be craving it because you remember that it tastes good, but the memory isn't good enough. If it was, you wouldn't need to buy the ice cream. You just, ice cream tastes so good. Yeah, and you got it, right? But no, you buy it, you take it home, take the lid off. Is that the point where it tastes so good? No. You put it on the spoon? No. It's when it hit contact. That's when the pleasant Vedana sets in, the actual contact. It's not the memory that sets off the craving. It's the memory that, if I get this, then I can get the pleasant Vedana. And when you get the pleasant Vedana, it reinforces the craving, which leads to clinging, becoming birth and death. Sense contacts happen because you have senses, and you leave your senses hanging out in the environment. If you're meditating and somebody starts making noise outside, you left your ears turned on. You're going to get the unpleasant Vedana. It's just the way the world works. The senses are part of having a mind and body. A mind and body with no senses would be, senseless. I mean, you couldn't survive. You use your senses to navigate the environment. So, having a mind and body that's functioning means it has senses that get sense contacts that are going to produce Vedana. And if you're not careful, you'll wind up in craving, clinging, becoming birth and death. The mind and body, that's dependent on consciousness. If you have a mind and body that's not conscious and it stays like that, that's being in a coma. It's going to be dead. Well, they can keep you alive with tubes, but that's not living. Right? So mind and body is dependent on consciousness. And it turns out consciousness is dependent on mind and body. You don't find consciousnesses independent of mind and body. I mean, unless you're encountering ghosts or something, but they don't seem to be a lot of those around. It's the interaction between mind and body that produces the consciousness, and the consciousness, that's what animates the mind and body. It's two things leaning against each other like two sheaves of wheat. You pull one away, the other one falls over as well. Now, there are other suttas. So what I gave you was 10 links. There are other suttas where it says the consciousness is dependent on sankharas. Now, is this a contradiction? Well, no. Something can have multiple necessary conditions. The light in your room has the light switch and the power lines and the generator and the light bulb. as necessary conditions. So consciousness has mind and body, but it also has an object, a sankhara, something that's created. We become conscious of the things of creation. And sankhara could be translated in the plural as the things of creation. And sankharas arise dependent on ignorance. Because we're ignoring the dependently originated nature of the universe, we take these sankharas as reality. We become conscious of them. We get sense contacts around them. The pleasant ones we crave, the unpleasant ones we crave for the absence of. That leads to clinging, becoming birth, death. This is the 12 links. It's definitely a bit more complex and difficult to understand what's going on here than it is with the simplified early description of dukkha arises dependent on clinging, arises dependent on craving, arises dependent on vedana, arises dependent on contact, arises dependent on namarupa. So why did we wind up with 12 links instead of the 6? Can't really say. Although the Vedic description of creation sounds a lot like the 12 links of dependent origination. So maybe there was bits of that were creeping into the teaching on dependent origination. So how should we interpret these 12 links? Well, the orthodox interpretation found in the Visuddhimagga is this is 3 lifetimes. The first 2, ignorance and sankharas, are your previous life. Sankharas being translated as karmic formations. So in your previous life, you made karma. That's led to your consciousness, mind, and body in this life, which has senses that get sense contacts, that generates vedana, and if you're not careful, does craving and clinging. That's this lifetime. And in a future life, well, you're going to die and you're clinging to being alive, so you will become again, be born, but you'll wind up dead there too. On a scale of 1 to 10, I give the probability of the 3 lifetime model of dependent origination being what the Buddha was talking about, a 0. There just aren't any suttas that really talk about a 3 lifetime model. There is Digha Nikaya 15 that's basically a 2 lifetime model. But far and away, most of the suttas just don't work for a multi-lifetime model. In the first place, the Dhamma is said to be timeless and visible here and now. And the Dhamma is also said to be dependent origination. How many lifetimes are visible to you here and now without resorting to time? Or even if you do resort to time, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. There's a number of logical flaws in that description of dependent origination. If we look at transcendental dependent origination, which is found in Samyutta 12:23, there's nothing there about multiple lifetimes. It's about practice in this lifetime. I won't go into transcendental dependent origination, but I will say that there is a brilliant little book on transcendental dependent origination by Bhikkhu Bodhi. You can probably find a copy of it on the Access to Insight.org website. Definitely worth recommending. The best way to look at dependent origination is moment to moment. I'll give you an example. Let's say you've never had a mango. You go into a grocery store, you're in the produce section, the sign says mangoes. And you're like, I've heard of mangoes, they're supposed to be good, so you buy a mango. You take it home, you put it away the rest of the groceries, hopefully, and then you attack the mango. You peel it, you make a mess, because that's what happens the first time you attack a mango. Now, you have a conscious mind and body. You have mango in your sticky fingers. contact, Vedana, pleasant Vedana. Oh yeah, this is good. I'm going to have some more. Craving has set in. This is excellent. I'm going to get some more mangoes. In fact, my friends, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, they've never had mangoes. I'm going to turn them on to mangoes. So you go back to the store, you get another mango, you go see your friends. This is after the pandemic's over, of course. And you turn them on to mangoes. And they're like, mangoes, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. And every time you go see your friends, you bring them a mango. You have given birth to the mango bringer. In other words, you've constructed a sense of self around the mango. And about the 7th time you show up with a mango, your friends are like, what's with all the mangoes? Uh-oh, death of the mango bringer. Because what you constructed was your ego, and as we know, egos are rather fragile and they just keep dying and falling apart. This is a much more useful way of looking at the links of dependent origination, seeing it happen to moment to moment, particularly the part about contact, Vedana, craving, clinging, dukkha. Oh, that was what we had in the first sutta, right? Yeah, that seems to be the heart of what the Buddha is teaching in terms of the links. But there's much more to dependent origination than the links. Remember, the phrase was idapataya ta paticca samuppada. This, that conditionality, dependent origination. The 12 links are the example par excellence of dependent origination, but it's not the full story. The full story is, well, the all-pervasive nature of this, that conditionality. This, that conditionality is this arises dependent on that. If that doesn't happen, this doesn't happen. Necessary conditions. And we find this occurring much more frequently in the suttas, and we find it, well, a much more important thing to understand. One of the more interesting suttas on the general case of dependent origination is Majjhima 38, the Greater Discourse on the Destruction of Craving. That sutta appears to be 2 discourses that were jammed together. We find that sometimes in the middle length and long discourses. And there's the first discourse is on bhava tanha, craving for becoming. And the second one is on kama tanha, craving for sense pleasures. The first part is about Sati, the son of a fisherman, who's a monk who has the pernicious view that consciousness transmigrates from incarnation to incarnation. Some other monks hear about this and they go to Sati and they ask him, is this true? Did you believe this? And he says, yes, as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, this consciousness transmigrates from incarnation to incarnation. They say, don't say that, Sati. The Buddha has taught many times that consciousness is dependently originated. But Sati was stubborn and he wouldn't give up his view. So those monks went to the Buddha, told him what happened. The Buddha says, you tell Sati the master calls. So that monk goes and tells Sati, the master calls you, friend Sati. Sati goes to the Buddha, sits, salutes the Buddha, sits down. The Buddha says, Sati, is it true you hold the view that I teach that consciousness transmigrates from incarnation to incarnation? Yes, Venerable Sir, that's what I understand. Sati, what is consciousness? Venerable Sir, it is that which speaks and feels and experiences here and there the results of good and bad actions. If you were to go around asking people, is this a good definition of consciousness, you might get a lot of yeses, right? It's that part of you that speaks So it's a little guy behind your eyeballs. He's got levers. He pulls the levers to make your mouth open so you can speak. And if you put your hand on a hot stove, he feels it, right? And yeah, he gets the results of good and bad actions this life and the next life, right? Right? The Buddha responds, "You foolish man, when have you ever known me to teach Dharma like that? For not have I not on many occasions said that consciousness is dependently originated? For without a condition, there is no arising of consciousness." Monks, do you understand the Dhamma taught by me in the same way as this bhikkhu Sati? "No, Venerable Sir, for on many occasions you have taught that consciousness is dependently originated." Good monks, it's good that you understand the Dhamma in this way. But this bhikkhu Sati stores up much demerit and will long be known by his pernicious view. And here we are, 2.5 millennia later, knowing poor old Sati because of his pernicious view. The Buddha says, "I will question the monks." Monks, do you understand when something has arisen? "Yes, Venerable Sir." "Do you understand it arises dependent on something else?" "Yes, Venerable Sir." "Do you understand that if the something else doesn't happen, that first thing's not going to arise?" "Yes, Venerable Sir." The questions go on for quite a while. At one point, the Buddha says, "Consciousness is reckoned by the condition upon which it depends. When it arises dependent on the eye and sights, it's eye consciousness. When it arises dependent upon the ear and sounds, ear consciousness. Nose and smells, nose consciousness. Tongue and taste, tongue consciousness. Body and textures, body consciousness. Mind and mind objects, mind consciousness. Just as a fire is reckoned by the condition on which it depends. When a fire is burning on grass, it's a grass fire. When it's burning on sticks, it's a stick fire. When it's burning on logs, it's a log fire. When it's burning on rubbish, it's a rubbish fire. When it's burning on a house, it's a house fire. When it's burning on cow dung, it's a cow dung fire. In just the same way, consciousness is reckoned by the condition upon which it depends. So now we have a third condition for the arising of consciousness. We had mind and body, and then we had sankharas, and now we have a sense contact. In fact, consciousness is said to be part of a sense contact. There's the object, the organ, and the sense consciousness. The three together coming together is actually what we call sense contact. Then what follows in the sutta is a catechism on, excuse me, it's a catechism on dependent origination. Lots of questions and answers about dependent origination. It's actually quite tedious. One of the more tedious sections in all of the suttas. I mean, you can read it if you want. I'm going to skip it until we get to the heart of the matter. So after all this discussion on dependent origination, the Buddha says to the monks, "Monks, knowing and seeing in this way," that is, in terms of dependent origination, "would you run back to the past wondering, was I in the past? Was I not in the past? What was I in the past? Being what? What did I become in the past?" "No, Venerable Sir." "Monks, knowing and seeing in this way, would you run ahead to the future wondering, will I be? Won't I be? What will I be? Being what? What will I become?" "No, Venerable Sir." "Monks, knowing and seeing in this way, in terms of dependent origination, would you be inwardly perplexed about the present, wondering, am I? Am I not? What am I? Where has this being come from? What will happen to it?" "No, Venerable Sir." Monks, are you saying this because I'm your teacher? No, Venerable Sir. Monks, are you saying this because you have understood and experienced this for yourselves? Yes, Venerable Sir. Good, monks. It's good that you understand this for yourself. So, the answer to sati is it's not his consciousness that transmigrates. It's not a thing. It's not him that transmigrates. In fact, the whole idea of transmigration doesn't really arise for one who really understands the general principle of dependent origination. The question, was I in the past? Will I be in the future? They just don't arise once you get the depth of dependent origination. It's sort of like the question, does it hurt if you fall off the edge of the world? Well, does it? I mean, come on, does it? I mean, do you land on something and it hurts? Or do you just keep falling, maybe faster and faster until friction sets you on fire? That would hurt. Or do you fall and fall and fall and eventually starve to death? That would hurt. Does it hurt if you fall off the edge of the world? Come on, answer the question. Well, because you don't believe in the edge of the world, because you understand it's a sphere and gravity and there's no wondering about the edge of the world. The question makes no sense at all, right? It's the same thing about, was I in the past? What will I be in the future? It's all dependently originated processes. I like to speak of soda pie, SODAPI, streams of dependently arising processes interacting. That's all there is. There's not anything else. There's just streams of dependently arising processes interacting. It's very dynamic and it's huge. The number of streams that are interacting at this moment to make you, well, is incalculable. Part of the streams is the fact that the British came to North America, ran off the Dutch, ran off the French, ran off the Spanish, suppressed the natives. They spoke English. So since I live in northern North America, I speak English, and you're hearing this Dhamma talk in English because the British came to northern North America. That's part of the streams that are making you who you are right now. There's genetic streams. There's your family of origin streams. There's the streams from your high school, your friends, where you've traveled, who you've heard the Dhamma from. Innumerable streams impinging on what you call me. But truth is, you're not a noun. You're a verb. You're a bunch of processes. You're a circulatory process. You're a digestive process. You're a respiratory process, endocrine process. You're just a collection of processes. Processes that are dependent on so much else. I mean, I sincerely doubt that any of you have grown all the food that you've eaten so far this year. You're dependent on so many other people to do so many other things so you can get food. You might buy it and cook it. Or maybe somebody else buys it and cooks it for you. But there's somebody else growing it and somebody else taking it to the market. There's all this, that conditionality happening everywhere. The general principle of dependent origination is far more profound than the 12 links. That's what's going on in the universe. Unfortunately, we make the mistake of looking down, going, it's me, the most important thing in the universe. We make ourselves a noun, and then we want to figure out how we're going to live forever. We get an immortality project going. And the Buddha's saying, no, what's going on is just the intersection of a bunch of streams of dependently originated processes. Of course, it doesn't stop when they intersect with me. I do actions which are just more streams going out into the universe. It's sort of like we're a valve. There's this whole huge flow of streams of dependently originating processes coming into us, and we act on them and produce more streams going out into the universe. This is reality. This is what the Buddha is actually pointing to. This is his answer to Sati. Don't think that you are your consciousness or any other of the aggregates. See the dynamic nature of the universe. There's one more sutta I want to share with you. To me, it's the most profound sutta in the whole of the canon. This is Samyutta 12:15, the Kaccayanagotta Sutta. The Venerable Kaccayanagotta comes to the Buddha and asks, right view, right view. In what way, Venerable Sir, is there right view? Kaccayana, this world for the most part depends upon a duality, upon the notion of existence and the notion of non-existence. But for one who sees the arising of the world as it is with correct wisdom, there is no notion of non-existence. And for one who sees the ceasing of the world as it is with correct wisdom, there's no notion of existence. People are caught up in views and opinions and ideas. One with right view doesn't get caught up in views and opinions and ideas. One with right view does not take a stand about myself, my atta, my soul. One with right view sees that when there's an arising, it's only dukkha arising, and when there's a ceasing, it's only dukkha ceasing. Okay, so right view means not getting caught in the duality of existence and non-existence. It's much more dynamic than that. It's not getting caught in views and opinions. The Suta Nipata, book 4 that I mentioned earlier, it's full of suttas about keeping an open mind, not getting trapped in views and opinions, and in particular, not taking a stand about myself. Because if you say there is a self, you just fell into the existence fallacy. And if you say there's not a self, you just fell into the non-existence fallacy. Neither of these are going to help you understand what's really going on. What's really going on is when anything arises, when you make a thing out of it, it's a setup for dukkha. And when anything ceases, you've put it in the non-existent category, and again, it's a setup for dukkha. Anything that arises, it's not a source of lasting happiness, which is perhaps another translation for dukkha, not a source of lasting happiness. And anything that ceases, well, that too is not a source of lasting happiness. When you understand this, Kaccayana, you are independent, not dependent on others. Everything exists. This is one extreme. Nothing exists. This is the opposite extreme. Without veering towards either of these extremes, a Tathagata teaches the Dhamma via the middle. Idapataya cha paticca samuppada. This, that conditionality, dependent origination. Actually, the sutta doesn't say that. The sutta gives the 12 links of dependent origination in their forward arising order, and then the 12 links of dependent origination in their forward ceasing order. But that appears to be a corruption. At least that's what a number of scholars think. including Carolyn Reese Davids and Govind C. Pandey and myself. This is supported by the fact that the Chinese version of that sutta actually does say that conditionality, and then gives the 12 links. But the key thing here is, don't think in terms of existence. Don't think in terms of non-existence. See the general principle of dependent origination operating all the time. The last comment I'm going to make is that the Kaccayanagotta Sutta seems to be the most important Theravadan sutta for the Mahayana teachings on emptiness. The teachings on emptiness in the Mahayana really stem from Nagarjuna's Mulamayamaka Karika, the fundamental verses on the middle way. And in there, Nagarjuna says that the emptiness is dependent origination. Emptiness is said to be things are without an essence. They're empty of essence. And they're empty of essence because they're dependently originated. One last quote from the Mulamayamaka Karika. You are not the same as or different from the conditions on which you depend. You are neither severed from them nor forever fused with them. This is the deathless teaching of Buddhas who care for the world. So, questions. You can use the chat for your questions if you have them. Or if you really want to ask one, you can wave your hand and I'll call on you. Yona.
Hello. Ayya Khema speaks of achievement syndrome versus then what would be a good desire and the achievement syndrome. What would be the difference?
So a good desire would be wanting to understand the Dhamma, wanting to practice the Dhamma.
Yes.
Achievement syndrome would be so that I won't have any more dukkha, so my friends will think I'm wonderful, so that I'm enlightened, so that I won't come back, so that I can get to Nibbana. It's the so that is the problem, right? So it's the recognizing of this is an important and useful thing to do. Yeah, there's a so that in the background, but you do it because it's important and useful rather than focused on the destination. In particular, in learning the jhanas, I tell the students, pay attention to where you are in the instructions and what you're supposed to be doing at that point. Don't start looking for the jhanas. She gives that brilliant example of driving to New York City. You know, you need a road map. If you start looking for New York City, when you get to the end of your driveway, you're going to have a crash before you get to the corner, right? Just know where you are and what you should be doing. So yes, there is the promise of the end of dukkha if you can do the practice well enough. But do the practice. The journey is really beneficial as well. Don't just be focused on so that you get to the end. Phil.
Yes, thank you, Leigh. Thank you for your talk. I feel that your review, your interpretation of dependent origination seems much more meaningful to me, and I've been mired in confusion about the 12 links ever since I thought perhaps maybe at some stage in my development, I would understand them, but this seems so much more meaningful. I feel that you're onto something. This confusion, though, you've helped me achieve some clarity about it, but the confusion still persists. May I ask if you could review, and I think I read this perhaps in another book that you wrote, where you mentioned it. Perhaps it was in Right Concentration. You addressed this topic as well. Maybe you developed it more fully in your more current book. But could you review what you think are the most helpful? I appreciate your saying that there's more to it than the links, but the links that you enunciated seem much more understandable and meaningful. And where I still have some confusion is where you continued and you incorporated becoming, birth and death. That part, I still don't understand how those fit into your reformulation or reinterpretation, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I'd say it's very good that you don't understand that, because I don't understand that either. I think it got stuffed in there. When we look at the suttas, we find many different ways that it's talked about. And some of them have birth and becoming in there, and some of them don't. Some of them have the six senses, some of them don't. In the appendix for the book I'm working on, I spell it all out for not all the suttas, but for probably about 50 suttas as to what you find. And it's quite a variety. So if the birth and becoming doesn't really fit, I don't think it's important. What's important is to understand that dukkha arises dependent on clinging, which arises dependent on craving, which arises dependent on Vedana, which arises dependent on sense contact. And that's the key bits. The fact that sense contact is dependent on either the six senses or Namarupa, yeah, that's important to understand too. But the key bits is the dukkha dependent on clinging, dependent on craving, dependent on Vedana, dependent on sense contact. That's the heart of the links.
Okay. May I ask another question?
Yeah.
All right. So what do you think then is the practical importance? In what way can we use this understanding of dependent origination? And I believe that you'll be familiar with Buddhadasa's. Buddhadasa used to give the advice about, I believe he used to say, if you can, I believe it was at the point of liking, basically positive, negative, neutral. It was if mindfulness is present at that point, then you can, here's my language, it's sort of like you are not then caught in the stream that leads down to dukkha.
You have a chance to not get caught in the stream. Sometimes you get a pleasant Vedana and you can see the craving coming and you're like, yeah, okay. And you just get lost in the craving because, well, we're not fully awakened. But yeah, a way to break it is second establishment of mindfulness of Vedana. So when you have an experience, there's going to be a Vedana. When there's a sensory input, it's always going to be a Vedana within 1/10 of a second. And you need to keep your mindfulness in there and realize, oh, this is pleasant. No problem with knowing it's pleasant. The only problem is when it gets out of hand and it falls off into craving and clinging. Right? So yes, the key is to get your mindfulness in there between the Vedana and the craving. And there's a gap. I mean, there's not much of a gap between sense contact and Vedana, and you can't do anything about it anyhow. But there's a bigger gap between the Vedana and the onset of the craving. And if you get your mindfulness in there and go, oh, this is pleasant, I'll just enjoy it. as opposed to, oh, this is pleasant. I'm going to get me some and keep it and yeah, set up for dukkha. Right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. I have some chat questions here. Can you say a bit on Ayya lineage, and are there relics? So Ayya lineage would go back to the Venerable Jnana Rama, who was a Sri Lankan monk. If you go to my website, which is leighb.com, and go click on the reading list, you'll find a couple books by Venerable Jnana Rama. One of them mistranslates nibbida as revulsion. So if you get that book and you come across the word revulsion, retranslate it as disenchantment. Okay, sorry, somebody messed up there. But anyhow, so that was her teacher. Before that, she had studied with Venerable Kantipalo, who was an Englishman, and she met him in Australia. I don't know Venerable Nanarama's lineage further back than that. And I don't know Kantipalo's further back than that, although there's some books about Kantipalo that would give some of his lineage. Actually, though, I would say Ayya root teacher was the Buddha. I mean, she taught herself the jhanas from reading the suttas. It blows me away, you know. Yeah, so her lineage is really straight from the Buddha with some assists from Kantipalo and Venerable Nanarama. Are there relics? There's a stupa at Buddha House in southern Germany, which is the retreat center she founded there. And her relics are in that stupa as far as I know. And then how to cut the streams of suffering. Well, one of them is to, on a sense contact basis, get your mindfulness in there between the Vedana and the onset of craving and clinging. If you miss that and you find yourself craving, see if you can let go of it. If you find yourself clinging, see if you can let go of it. This is the moment to moment working with it. The long-term goal, though, is to uproot the ignorance of the self, the ignoring the fact that this solidly seeming me is just another dependently arising process. We're sotapai as well. And so looking at the whole world as just streams of dependently arising processes interacting, and at the same time looking at myself as that, I begin to get a sense of, yeah, I'm not as solid as I thought I was. Then what the Buddha basically is saying is concentrate your mind and then examine reality in this way over and over again until you have a willingness to give up everything, to let go. And if you can be willing to give up everything because you've actually reached the point of realizing, yeah, ain't nothing that can be held on to, let alone worth holding on to, and you're willing to let go completely, then you might have a breakthrough in consciousness that cuts the streams of suffering. Sustaining awareness of dependent origination protects the mind from slipping back into the self-delusion. Yes, very definitely. Keeping dependent origination in the forefront about the self and about everything else really gives you a much clearer picture of what's going on. And that gives you a much better chance of not conceiving of yourself as the center of the universe. Yeah, so one thing that I've I mean, a lot of this talk actually came from practicing the jhanas and then in the same sitting, just contemplating dependent origination, starting with the 12 links, because that's all I knew to begin with, and just saying them to myself and trying to see the connections there. And then eventually getting a sense of, oh yeah, there's more going on here than just the 12 links, and just investigating that. You know, read a sutta that talks about dependent origination, then sit down, meditate, and then reflect on that sutta. Yeah, these are good things. Apparently the audio cut out when I was talking about Ayya, and the question was, did I mention the relics? The relics would all be entombed, as far as I know, in her stupa in southern Germany at Buddha House, which is her retreat center that she founded there near the city of Kempten in Bavaria in Germany. We don't see much in the suttas about vibhava tanha. How does this lead to becoming and birth? Sutta references. The only sutta reference I can give you off the top of my head on vibhava tanha, craving for becoming, is the one I mentioned, Majjhima 38, the first half of that sutta. How does this lead to becoming and birth? Yeah, I don't know of a sutta reference where it's spelled out. But certainly at the time of the Buddha, becoming was becoming in this life. I want to become rich and famous. And becoming in the next life. I want to become reborn in a family that has a Mercedes Benz. Or I want to become a deva. Okay, and then this would be bhava tanha. And then vibhava tanha would be the craving to not become. And this is what the Jains were into. Vibhava tanha would, in this life, I don't want to become sick with COVID, or I don't want to be reborn again. So falling into the non-existence category. I can't think of, Majjhima 38 talks about bhava tanha, but I don't see much about vibhava tanha anywhere that I can remember. Sorry. What is the Buddha's definition of right view that you mentioned from the Kaccayanagotta Sutta? This world, for the most part, depends upon a duality, upon the notion of existence and the notion of non-existence. But this one with right view doesn't cling to views and opinions. This one with right view does not take a stand about myself, my soul, my atta. Everything exists as one extreme, nothing exists as the other extreme. Without veering towards either of these extremes, a Tathagata teaches the Dhamma via the middle. It's that conditionality, dependent origination. That would be the summary of that. If you go to my website and click on suttas, and then click on multiple translations of a single sutta on one page, then you'll find Samyutta 1215 there, and you click on that, and I believe I have about 6 translations of that sutta side by side. And so, yeah, you can look at the Pali and look at the various people's translations of it. Other questions? Of course, we've run past the 8:30 time, so if anyone wants to leave, I probably won't even notice because I'll be busy doing whatever I'm doing. Feel free to leave. But if there are more questions, I'll be happy to answer the questions.
Leigh, I have another question, if I may.
Okay. I just posted the link to the Kaccayanagotta Sutta from my website in the chat. So those of you who are interested can click that link or copy it down. So go ahead, Phil.
I just want to make sure there's no other questions that are pending before I ask a second question.
How to relate to goal setting with right view. Think of Nibbana like the North Star. It orients you, but you're not trying to get to the North Star, right? So use the promise of the path to orient you and then work on the practice given where you are, right? And so if you sit down and you're not very concentrated, yeah, you need to get concentrated. The goal isn't concentration, but it's a useful thing to do along the way. And once you're concentrated, then you want insight into the nature of reality. The goal isn't insight into reality, it's just examining reality. You'll get some insights. The goal is to keep practicing such that you have a deeper understanding of what's going on, so deep that you uproot the ignorance of thinking that you have a self, that you are existent or non-existent. M. Doyle has an incomplete question. I don't know what if you can type more, it just, One of Ayya Khema's Dhamma talks, she mentioned an example where you walk into a room of people and detect primarily negative vibes. How do you counteract or smooth it out? It may not be your job to counteract it or smooth it out. It may be your job not to get lost in those negative vibes. That may be what's much more important. But if you can say things that are helpful, then by all means say those things. But just remember what the Buddha's instructions were. It needs to be truthful, useful, timely, and said with a heart full of love. But yeah, how to find it, it's situational. Just make sure you've got those 4 things going for you. Can you clarify the difference between clinging and craving? They seem very similar to me. Craving is I want it and is focused on the object. Clinging is I've got it and it's focused on the subject, me as the possessor. So yeah, there's a similarity, but the craving is going out for it and the clinging is possessing it. Both of them require a craver or clinger. It requires somebody, a self, to do the craving and clinging. It's just that sometimes we're relating to it in terms of I want to get it, and sometimes we're relating to it in terms of it's mine, I'm keeping it. Ayya Khema seems to have a certain definition of meditation that I didn't quite catch. How would she define meditation? So Ayya Khema took the word jhana, which literally means meditation, and she defined meditation as jhana practice. I would define meditation as a wordless or mostly wordless investigation of reality. So I'm giving it a broader definition. There are ways to investigate that involve concentrating the mind, so you have concentration meditation. And there are ways that are investigating reality that are more insight focused, so you have insight meditation. So Ayya and I don't quite agree there, but she was taking the word jhana literally as meditation and saying practice the jhanas is the only real meditation. Phil, nobody else has one up, so you're on.
Okay, Leigh, thanks. You have this interesting idea that piti and sukha are associated with certain neurotransmitters, dopamine for piti and endorphins for sukha.
Right.
I'm curious how you came up with that idea, or if that's your original idea of how you came up with it. And every manipulation that I'm aware of that people use to get those experiences associated with dopamine and with endorphins lead to tolerance and lead to a diminishment of the experiences that are associated with them. Is that the case? Is that one of the reasons why you think that PT and Sukha are associated with those neurotransmitters? And do they also diminish as a result of repeated experiencing? And then I have another
Okay, let me do
what I want to add on. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Let me do one first.
All right.
Yeah. So I read an article. It's linked actually from that page that you referenced, the Neurological Correlates of the Jhanas, seeking the powerful and mysterious brain circuitry that makes us love Google, Twitter, and texting by Emily Yof from Slate magazine. I read that, and it talked about dopamine and opioids. And now I've had a long interest for a long time about what's going on when I'm experiencing these jhanas. And I've actually meditated for science multiple times so that I could get some idea. One of the things they mentioned was that the nucleus accumbens, this reward center in the center of the brain, is on overdrive in the second jhana. Nucleus accumbens is associated with dopamine and opioids. So, all right, so that's what clued me in. And I, thought about it, did some research, came across, various articles, talked to Judson Brewer, who's a neuroscientist at Brown University now. And he was like, yeah, makes sense that actually PT is dopamine breaking down into norepinephrine. So it was reading that article and then thinking about it and doing some research and talking to people that I came up with it. Everything we experience is neurotransmitters. Everything. Okay, you're hearing my words right now. That's neurotransmitters. I'm vibrating something in my throat, the air is going out, vibrating the microphone, it's coming out of your speaker, it's going into your ear, it's vibrating your eardrum and the hammer, anvil, and stirrup in your ear. And then there's neurotransmitters happening. So all of our experience is neurotransmitters. So which neurotransmitters was the question for me, not is it neurotransmitters, obviously neurotransmitters. And this is the two I came up with. For the jhanas, we have a limited store of them. And what people often find is if they get into, say, the second jhana, they can only maintain it for a certain period before it just sort of falls over into the third as they run out of the neurotransmitters that is generating the second jhana. And the same thing with the third. You just sort of run out of that and you fall into the fourth. So we do have a limited amount there. And yeah, it's more difficult to get in the second time in the same sitting. All right. So you're sitting there, you got into your first jhana, you get into the second jhana, oops, you lost it. All right, get back in. And that second time to get back in is a little more difficult because, well, you used up some of your store of neurotransmitters. But there doesn't seem to be any long-term excuse me, there doesn't seem to be any long-term effect of, you can't get in again. Once you learn what to do, it generates very easily. And I think that's because you're not taking something from the outside. I mean, yeah, if you're taking in something externally, then that does seem to lead to habituation, and yeah, you don't get the same kick. But for the jhanas, yeah, if you do the practice well, yeah, you can get just as intensely concentrated 30 years later as you were when you were first learning, because the intensity level of the jhanas actually may improve as you get more skilled at it. And I say this from 30 years experience.
Yeah, so interesting. So the other thing I wanted to ask is, from what I've read about dopamine seems to be, I believe the description is it's associated with motivated. It's a behavior motivator. It's what the thing that I would say about it, my paraphrasing would be, it's pleasant anticipation. It's associated with I want it, which sounds very much to me like craving.
Mhm.
Okay, so I find that to be interesting. I'm not sure how to put that together, because you talked a lot about craving.
Right. So there are multiple ways to generate different neurotransmitters. Okay. One way to generate dopamine is craving. Right? You think of something you want and you start fantasizing about it and wanting to get it, and that'll get you the dopamine hit. Right? You're surfing Facebook and you're just looking for another hit of dopamine. All right. But there are other ways to do it. And one of those ways is to get your mind concentrated enough and then focus on something pleasant. And that will generate dopamine as well. And there's no craving associated with it. And in fact, if there's craving associated with it, first hindrance ain't going to happen. All right. So you're generating the dopamine, which is breaking down into norepinephrine, which is the PT experience, via a different route other than craving. And in fact, if craving is part of the route, it ain't going to work.
So interesting. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff.
It's like it's being evoked directly rather than sort of exogenously through either drugs or some external stimuli.
Yeah, that's the difference. You're generating this with your mind. You found a way to make yourself excitedly happy by just sitting down and making yourself excitedly happy. You don't need anything external. That's a powerful thing, especially as a side effect of having done that. You now have a mind that's more concentrated and better able to investigate reality. It's the side effect that's important. Any other questions? Okay. May any merit from this sharing of the Dhamma be for the benefit and liberation of all beings everywhere. May you all have a good evening.
Sadhu. Sadhu. Sadhu.
May you all have a good evening and a fruitful journey on the path.
Thank you, Leigh.
Thank you.